She looked at the man kneeling in front of her father's $25 million car, threw her head back in front of 300 of the wealthiest people in Beverly Hills, and laughed loud enough for every phone in the room to catch it. "Fine," Clara Whitmore said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, carrying clean across the marble floor. "Fix it, and I will marry you." The room exploded. Champagne glasses clinked together in mockery. Nobody believed for 1 second that the joke was real. But Marcus Bennett was already reaching for his toolbox, and by the time the sun rose over Beverly Hills, the woman who mocked him would understand exactly who she had been laughing at. Before we begin, I want to say thank you for being here. If this is your first time watching one of my stories, please take a moment to subscribe and stay with me until the very end. And I would love it if you left a comment telling me which city you are watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The evening had started like every other evening at the Whitmore estate, which is to say it had started like a performance. Clara Whitmore stood near the grand staircase in a pale gold gown that cost more than most people's yearly salary greeting guests, with a smile that had been practiced since she was 6 years old. She had learned that smile from her mother. She had learned it the way other children learn to ride a bicycle, through repetition and correction, until it no longer felt like a mask at all. It simply felt like her face. "Clara, darling, you look radiant." That was Eleanor Whitmore, her mother, gliding toward her in a cloud of perfume and diamonds, already scanning the room the way a general scans a battlefield. "The Hendersons are here, the Prescotts. Even old Richard Ashford flew in from Geneva just for this." "I know, Mother. I invited them. I only mention it because tonight needs to be perfect." Eleanor's fingers brushed an invisible piece of lint from Clara's shoulder. "Your father would have wanted this car unveiled properly, not as some sideshow, as a tribute." Clara felt her chest tighten the way it always did when her father was mentioned. 2 years since his passing, and the wound still opened easily, like a door that never fully closed. "I know what tonight is supposed to be, Mother." "Then smile a little wider, dear. The cameras are already out." Clara did smile wider. It cost her nothing. It always did. The car sat beneath a heavy velvet curtain in the center of the estate's grand courtyard, illuminated from beneath by soft golden light that made the fabric glow like something holy. It was a 1962 custom-built roadster, one of only 3 ever made, restored over 18 months by a team of specialists flown in from 3 continents. Her father had spent the final years of his life chasing this restoration the way other men chase forgiveness. It was in every sense that mattered to Clara, the last piece of him she had left to give the world. 250 guests, reporters from 4 luxury lifestyle magazines, a live stream running on the estate's private social channels, already climbing past 40,000 viewers. Everything had been planned to the minute. At exactly 9:15, Daniel Cross, the estate's director of operations, appeared at Clara's side. He was a tall man in his 40s, with the kind of smooth, unbothered confidence that made people trust him before they had any reason to. He had worked for the Whitmore family for 6 years, ever since Clara's father hired him personally, and Clara had never once had cause to question his loyalty. "We're ready when you are," Daniel said, his voice low and warm. "The mechanics did a final check an hour ago. Everything is perfect." "You're sure?" "Clara." He smiled, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "I would not let anything go wrong tonight. Not with this car, not with your father's legacy." Clara nodded, drawing a slow breath, and stepped forward toward the small stage that had been built beside the covered vehicle. The crowd quieted as she raised the microphone. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady, even as her heart pounded beneath the gold fabric of her gown. 2 years ago, my father passed away, and with him went a piece of history that I know many of you loved as much as he did. Tonight, we don't just unveil a car. We unveil his final gift to this world. Applause rippled through the courtyard. "Without further delay," Clara said, gesturing toward the stagehand waiting by the curtain, "let's bring my father home." The velvet curtain dropped. Gasps rose from the crowd as the roadster was revealed in full, its deep crimson paint catching every light in the courtyard, its chrome trim gleaming like liquid silver. Cameras flashed in a storm of white light. Somewhere in the back, someone actually began to applaud before the engine had even turned over, as if the sight alone were enough. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. For one perfect moment, standing in front of everyone who mattered in her world, she felt her father close to her again. "Would anyone like to hear it run?" she asked, her voice trembling with something close to joy. The crowd roared its approval. Tony Reyes, the lead mechanic who had overseen the restoration, stepped forward and opened the driver's door with the reverence of a man handling a religious artifact. He slid into the seat, adjusted his gloves, and turned the key. Nothing happened. A small ripple of confused laughter passed through the crowd, the kind of laughter people offer when they assume a mistake is about to be corrected in seconds. Tony tried again. Still nothing. Not even a click. "Give it a second," Clara whispered to herself, gripping the microphone stand so tightly her knuckles went pale. Tony climbed out, lifted the hood, and gestured for two other mechanics to join him. The confused laughter in the crowd shifted into murmurs. Somewhere near the back, a woman in an emerald dress whispered something to her husband, who chuckled and lifted his phone to record. "What's happening?" Eleanor appeared at Clara's elbow, her smile still perfectly intact but her eyes sharp with alarm. "I don't know," Clara said. "Give them a minute." A minute became 5. 5 became 15. The three mechanics huddled around the open engine, speaking in low, tense voices, occasionally trying the ignition again with the same lifeless result. Each failed attempt sent a fresh wave of whispers through the courtyard, growing louder, less kind. $25 million, someone muttered nearby, just loud enough for Clara to hear, and it can't even start. Clara's smile finally cracked. Daniel appeared at her side again, his expression carefully neutral, though something in his eyes seemed almost too calm for the chaos unfolding in front of them. "It might be a battery connection issue," he offered. "These old restorations, sometimes the electrical work needs recalibrating after transport." "Fix it!" Clara said, through gritted teeth, still smiling for the cameras even as panic clawed up her throat. "Fix it now, Daniel." "I'll see what I can do." 20 more minutes passed. The mechanics swapped the battery. Nothing. They checked the starter motor. Nothing. They ran a full diagnostic scan using equipment flown in specifically for the restoration. The screen returned nothing but errors, contradictory readings that made no sense given how meticulously the car had been rebuilt. By now, the crowd had stopped pretending to be patient. Conversations had turned openly mocking. Someone near the champagne fountain laughed loudly enough to carry across the courtyard. "Maybe the ghost of old man Whitmore doesn't want it started." Clara flinched as if she had been slapped. Richard Ashford, a silver-haired collector known throughout the industry for his brutal honesty and his even more brutal wallet, sauntered toward Clara with a glass of scotch in hand and an expression of thinly veiled amusement. "Clara, darling?" he said, his voice carrying easily to the guests nearby. "I've seen a lot of failed restorations in my time, but I have to say this one takes the prize for sheer spectacle. Tell you what, I'll take it off your hands right now. Half price. Consider it a mercy." "It's not for sale, Richard. It's not running either." He smiled, sipping his scotch. "Machines like this, once they go quiet, they rarely come back. I've seen it 100 times. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let go before it becomes an even bigger embarrassment." Clara felt her face burn. Every word Richard spoke was calculated to land in front of as many witnesses as possible, and it was working. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, could feel the weight of 250 judgments settling onto her shoulders like stones. "We are not selling my father's car tonight, Richard. Or any night." "Suit yourself?" He shrugged, already turning to rejoin his circle of admirers loud enough for the words to trail behind him. "Though I wonder what your father would say, watching his legacy die in front of everyone he ever tried to impress." The words hit harder than Clara expected. She turned away quickly, blinking back tears. She refused to let anyone see and found Daniel waiting for her near the stage. "Perhaps," Daniel said gently, "it would be wiser to postpone the demonstration. Move the party inside. Save face before this gets any worse." "Save face?" Clara's voice cracked. "Daniel, this was supposed to be his moment. I promised everyone tonight would be perfect." "Sometimes," Daniel said, his voice smooth as silk, "the bravest thing a person can do is know when to stop." Clara stared at the car, at the useless engine glowing uselessly under expensive lighting, and felt something inside her chest begin to crumble. 2 years of grief. 18 months of restoration work, hundreds of thousands of dollars. All of it reduced to a joke whispered behind champagne glasses. "Give me 5 more minutes," she said quietly. "Just 5. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, so briefly that Clara didn't notice it at all. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need." The mechanics tried 3 more times, 3 more failures. The crowd had begun drifting toward the open bar in 2s and 3s, no longer even pretending to watch their laughter and gossip, filling the courtyard where applause should have been. Bianca Ferrante, a young socialite with nearly 2 million followers online, stood near the front with her phone raised, narrating quietly to her live stream audience. "Okay, so this is officially a disaster. The car will not start. Clara Whitmore's whole gala is falling apart in real time, and honestly, I am here for the drama." Clara heard every word. She felt the tears finally threatening to spill and turned away from the crowd, walking a few steps toward the edge of the stage just to catch her breath, just to hide her face for one single moment before she had to smile again. That was when she heard the voice, quiet, steady, coming from somewhere near the back of the crowd near the service entrance where the estate staff usually stood out of sight during events like this. "I can fix it." The words weren't loud, but something in the stillness of the moment carried them clean across the courtyard, cutting through the noise like a single note held perfectly in tune. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Clara turned too, blinking through unshed tears, searching the crowd for the source of the voice. Standing near the back half in shadow was a man in a simple gray work uniform, worn boots, and a heavy canvas toolbox held loosely in one hand. His name was Marcus Bennett, and Clara realized with a small jolt that she recognized his face, though she could not immediately place why. He had worked at the estate for 3 years. She had passed him in the hallways 100 times, thanked him absently for fixing a leaking faucet or a flickering light, and never once thought about him again after the door closed behind him. He stepped forward now, calm and unhurried, as if the eyes of 250 of the wealthiest people in California were not currently fixed on him, with something between disbelief and amusement. "I understand machines," he said, simply stopping a respectful distance from the car. "I'd like to take a look." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the laughter started. It began as a single snort of disbelief from somewhere near the bar, and it spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass until the entire courtyard seemed to be shaking with it. A billionaire heiress, a mansion full of engineers, industrialists, and collectors who owned fleets of vintage cars, and a handyman standing there in scuffed work boots calmly announcing that he could succeed where a team of world-class mechanics had already failed. "Oh, this is too good," Bianca said into her phone, practically vibrating with excitement. "The handyman is going to try to fix a $25 million car. This night just got so much better." Richard Ashford laughed loudest of all, nearly spilling his scotch. "By all means," he called out, waving his glass toward Marcus with theatrical grandeur. "Please, enlighten us." Clara stared at Marcus, humiliation and desperation warring inside her chest. Every instinct told her to dismiss him to protect what little dignity remained of the evening by refusing to let a member of the household staff embarrass her further in front of her guests. But another part of her, quieter and more desperate, whispered that nothing left to lose meant nothing left to lose. "You," she said, and even to her own ears the word sounded harsher than she intended. Marcus met her gaze without flinching. There was something in his eyes that Clara hadn't expected. Not fear, not embarrassment, something closer to quiet certainty. "I understand machines," he repeated. "Let me look." The crowd laughed harder. Eleanor appeared at Clara's side, gripping her daughter's arm with fingers like talons. "Clara, do not do this. Do not let the help make a spectacle of your father's memory." But Clara was staring at Marcus at the calm, unshaken way he stood among the mockery surrounding him, and something in her cracked open, something reckless and raw and furious at the entire evening, at Richard Ashford's cruelty, at Daniel's suggestion to simply give up at her own helplessness in the face of a machine that refused to obey her. She smiled sharp and bitter and raised her voice loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. "Fine," she said. "Fix it and I'll marry you." The words hung in the air for exactly 1 second before the courtyard exploded into laughter so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the estate. Champagne glasses clinked together in mocking toasts. Somewhere near the bar, someone actually applauded the joke, as if Clara had just delivered the punchline of the century. Bianca nearly dropped her phone in excitement. "Did she just say what I think she said? Oh my God, you guys! She just said she'll marry the handyman if he fixes the car. This is the best night of my entire life." Eleanor's face went white with horror. Clara, what have you done?" "It's a joke, Mother." Clara's voice trembled slightly despite her attempt at composure. "It's not real. He's not going to fix it." But even as she said the words, some small, treacherous part of her was already watching Marcus walk toward the car, and something about the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, utterly unbothered by the laughter still rippling around him, made that certainty feel less solid than it had a moment before. Marcus set his toolbox down beside the open hood and looked at the engine for a long moment without touching anything. Tony Reyes, the lead mechanic, straightened up beside him, arms crossed clearly, unwilling to be shown up in front of his employer by a member of the household staff. "We've run every diagnostic there is," Tony said, not bothering to hide the edge in his voice. "Trust me, if there was something simple wrong with this engine, we would have found it hours ago." "I believe you checked everything the diagnostic tools could see," Marcus said quietly, still studying the engine. "But some problems don't show up on a screen," Tony scoffed. "And you'd know that how exactly you fix light fixtures for a living." Marcus didn't answer right away. He crouched beside the engine, reaching into his toolbox for a small flashlight, and began examining the fuel lines with a focus that seemed almost meditative, utterly indifferent to the laughter still drifting from the crowd behind him. "This is amazing content," Bianca whispered into her phone. "Absolutely amazing." Clara found herself moving closer despite her mother's protest, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. She stood a few feet from Marcus, watching him work, watching the careful, methodical way his hands moved across components that had defeated 3 professional mechanics for over an hour. "You really think you can find something they missed?" she asked, her voice quieter now, some of the earlier bite drained out of it. Marcus glanced up at her, and for the first time that evening, Clara saw something flicker behind his calm expression. Not arrogance, not resentment for the laughter, for the years of being overlooked in the hallways of her own home. Something closer to quiet, steady confidence, the kind that comes only from someone who has done this exact thing 1,000 times before in circumstances far more consequential than a party. "I think," Marcus said slowly, running his fingers along a fuel line near the base of the engine, "that this car was never broken by accident." The courtyard, which had begun to grow quiet as more guests drifted back toward the stage to watch the spectacle continue, went completely silent at those words. "What did you say?" Clara whispered. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was staring at something near the base of the engine block, his expression shifting from calm focus into something sharper, more intent. His fingers hovered over a small component tucked deep within the engine bay, a component that to any untrained eye looked identical to every other piece of machinery surrounding it. But Marcus was not looking at it with an untrained eye. "This part," he murmured almost to himself, "this is an original." Tony stepped closer, frowning. "What are you talking about? Every component in this engine was verified against the restoration report before installation." "Then someone verified a lie," Marcus said quietly, still staring at the mismatched part with an intensity that made the hairs on Clara's arms rise. "Because whoever installed this component did it after the final inspection, and they did it on purpose." A murmur rippled through the crowd, confusion mixing with something sharper, now something closer to real interest. Bianca's phone was rock steady, her earlier giggling excitement replaced by genuine focus as she zoomed in on Marcus's face. Clara felt her heart pounding in her chest. "Someone did this on purpose. You mean the car didn't just fail? Someone sabotaged it." Marcus looked up at her, and in the golden light spilling across the courtyard, Clara saw something in his expression that chilled her more than anything Richard Ashford or her own mother had said all evening. "I think," Marcus said carefully, choosing each word as if it carried weight he wasn't ready to fully release yet, "that you need to ask yourself who had access to this car after the final inspection, and who benefits the most from it never starting again." Behind Clara, standing near the edge of the stage where he had watched the entire scene unfold with practiced, unreadable calm, Daniel Cross's expression flickered for just a fraction of a second, so brief that almost no one in the courtyard noticed it at all. Almost no one. Because Marcus Bennett, still crouched beside the engine with his fingers resting against the tampered component, happened to glance up at exactly the right moment, and for one long silent second, his eyes met Daniel's across the crowded courtyard. Neither man looked away. Neither man looked away. For 3 full seconds, the courtyard around them seemed to fade into background noise. The champagne toasts and cruel laughter reduced to nothing more than static. Marcus held Daniel's gaze, the way a man holds a door shut, against a storm, steady, unblinking, refusing to be the first to break. Then Daniel smiled a small practice smile that reached nowhere near his eyes and turned to whisper something to the young woman standing beside him, as if nothing at all had passed between them. Clara caught the exchange. She wasn't sure exactly what she had seen, but she had spent 29 years in rooms full of people who smiled while hiding daggers behind their backs, and she recognized the shape of it instantly. "Marcus," she said quietly, crouching down beside him near the open engine, close enough now that only he could hear her. "What did you mean someone did this on purpose?" Marcus didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the edge of the mismatched component, following a seam that shouldn't have existed on a part installed less than 2 months earlier. "Look here," he said, angling his flashlight so she could see. "This bracket. See how the metal around the mounting bolt is scratched? I don't know what I'm looking at." "Fresh tool marks," Marcus said. "Recent ones. Whoever did this wasn't careful because they thought nobody would ever look this closely. They assumed the car would just fail to start. Everyone would blame old age and bad luck, and that would be the end of it. But you looked closely. I always look closely." His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "It's the only thing that ever kept me alive in this business." Tony Reyes had drifted closer, arms still crossed his earlier scorn, now tinged with something more uncertain. "Even if you're right about the tool marks," he said, though with noticeably less bite than before, "that doesn't prove sabotage. Could have happened during transport. Could have been a mechanic on the original team who made a mistake." "Could have," Marcus agreed evenly. "Except this part right here." He reached into the engine bay and carefully extracted a small metal bracket, holding it up so the golden lights of the courtyard caught its surface. "This is a modern replacement, mass-produced, cheap. It doesn't match the specification sheet your team would have used for a restoration this precise. A mechanic who cared enough to spend 18 months on a car like this would never install something like this by accident." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, quieter this time, less mocking and more uncertain. Bianca zoomed her phone in tight on the small metal piece in Marcus's hand, narrating in a hushed, excited whisper. "Oh my God, you guys, is this actually happening right now? Is the Handyman about to expose a sabotage plot at a billionaire's engagement gala? I did not sign up for this level of content tonight." Richard Ashford, who had been watching from a few feet away with his scotch nearly forgotten in his hand, stepped forward with a frown creasing his weathered face. "Let me see that," he said, holding out his palm with the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed instantly. Marcus hesitated only a fraction of a second before placing the bracket in Richard's hand. Richard turned it over slowly, his frown deepening as he examined the stamped manufacturer code on its underside. He had spent 40 years buying, selling, and restoring vintage automobiles, and whatever skepticism he'd carried into this moment was visibly draining from his face with every second he studied the part. "This is aftermarket," Richard said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier mockery. "Cheap aftermarket at that. No restoration team on Earth would use this on a car worth $25 million. He looked up first at Tony, then slowly at Marcus. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Buried behind the fuel regulator," Marcus said. "Somewhere nobody checks unless they already suspect something's wrong. Somewhere a standard diagnostic wouldn't flag because the part still technically completes the circuit. It just does it badly. Just enough to cause exactly the kind of failure you saw tonight." Clara felt her stomach twist into a hard, cold knot. "You're saying whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted it to fail tonight, in front of everyone." "I'm saying," Marcus said carefully, "that this wasn't random, and it wasn't old age, and it definitely wasn't a mistake made by the team that spent 18 months getting every other detail of this car perfect." The crowd had gone almost entirely silent now, the earlier laughter replaced by a tense electric hush. Even the string quartet stationed near the terrace had stopped playing their bows frozen mid-air as they watched the scene unfold. Eleanor pushed through the small circle that had formed around the car, her face pale beneath her perfectly applied makeup. "This is absurd," she said, her voice sharp with the particular fury of someone watching a carefully constructed evening collapse in real time. "Clara, you cannot seriously be entertaining accusations from household staff based on a piece of scrap metal. Mother, look at it." Clara held up the bracket Richard had just handed back to her, turning it so the light caught the mismatched finish. "This isn't scrap metal. This is proof someone tampered with Daddy's car. Or it's proof that this restoration team you hired was not nearly as competent as you paid them to be." Eleanor snapped, shooting a venomous glance toward Tony, who visibly flinched. "Either way, I fail to see how any of this requires the involvement of the pool boy." "I'm not the pool boy," Marcus said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, only a tired, weathered patience, the kind that comes from being reduced to a stereotype so many times that correcting it has become reflexive rather than emotional. "I maintain the estate's mechanical systems, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, and yes, occasionally vehicles." "Regardless of your job title," Eleanor said coolly, "this is not your place." "Mother!" Clara's voice cracked like a whip, sharper than anyone had heard it all evening. "He just found evidence that someone deliberately sabotaged Daddy's car in front of 250 guests. I think that makes it very much his place right now." For a moment, mother and daughter simply stared at each other, the tension between them crackling louder than the murmuring crowd around them. It was Daniel who finally broke the silence, stepping forward with the same smooth, unbothered composure he had carried all evening. Though Clara really noticed the faint sheen of sweat along his hairline that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Clara, if I may," Daniel said gently, placing a steady hand on her arm. "I understand this is distressing, but let's not jump to conclusions in front of our guests. Perhaps this part was simply mislabeled during a shipment. These things happen more often than you'd think in restoration work. I can have Tony's team investigate quietly, discreetly, without turning tonight into something uglier than it already has." "Discreetly," Clara repeated, slowly staring at him. "For your family's sake, for your father's memory." Marcus still crouched beside. The engine looked up at Daniel with an expression that gave nothing away, though something in his tone shifted just slightly, just enough for Clara to notice. "That's an interesting suggestion," Marcus said, handling it quietly, before anyone has a chance to ask who had access to this vehicle after the final inspection was signed off. Daniel's smile didn't waver, but his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Clara's arm. "I'm simply trying to protect this family from unnecessary embarrassment." "Funny," Marcus said, turning back to the engine, "because from where I'm sitting, the embarrassment already happened. The only question left is who's responsible for it." A visible tension crackled through the small circle of onlookers. Bianca's phone had never wavered from Daniel's face, and she leaned toward her nearest friend, whispering just loud enough for her phone microphone to catch it perfectly. "Okay, is it just me, or is Estate Guy acting super sketchy right now?" The comments section on her live stream, which had ballooned past 60,000 viewers in the last 20 minutes, exploded with agreement. Comments scrolled faster than she could read them. "Something is off with the guy in the suit. He looks nervous. Zoom in on his face. Who is this Marcus guy? Does anyone know him?" Clara pulled her arm gently from Daniel's grip. "I want to know who signed off on the final inspection of this car," she said. Her voice steady now, all traces of earlier panic replaced with something colder, sharper. "I want the paperwork. Tonight." Daniel's jaw tightened, though he recovered quickly, smoothing his expression back into practiced calm. "Of course, I'll have it brought out immediately." He turned and walked briskly toward the mansion, his phone already in hand, thumb moving rapidly across the screen as he disappeared through the side entrance. Clara watched him go, an uneasy feeling settling deep in her chest, though she couldn't yet name exactly why. "He's lying," Marcus said quietly, still working at the engine, not looking up. "How do you know?" "Because a man who's confident in his paperwork doesn't need to text someone before he goes to get it." Clara turned sharply back toward the mansion, but Daniel had already vanished from sight. 9 minutes passed in tense, uncertain silence as the crowd waited, whispering among themselves, some drifting back toward the bar with visible disappointment when the promised drama seemed to stall, others clustering tighter around the car, unwilling to miss whatever happened next. Richard Ashford lingered close by his earlier mockery, entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to genuine, calculating interest. "You," Richard said, studying Marcus with narrowed eyes. "You have a familiar way about you, the way you handled that diagnostic, the way you spoke about the fuel regulator like you'd built the entire system yourself." He paused. "Where did you train?" Marcus's hands stilled for just a moment over the engine before he continued working. "A long time ago, different life." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got tonight." Richard studied him a moment longer, something calculating flickering behind his eyes, before he simply nodded and stepped back, though he did not walk away entirely, choosing instead to linger at the edge of the crowd, watching Marcus with the sharp, evaluating gaze of a man who had just recognized something valuable and was quietly recalculating its worth. Tony Reyes, meanwhile, had crouched down on the other side of the engine, his earlier hostility replaced by a kind of grudging professional curiosity. "All right," he said quietly, low enough that only Marcus could hear him. "Say you're right. Say someone deliberately sabotaged this engine. How do we fix it? Because if this thing doesn't start in the next 20 minutes, this entire event is finished, and so is my company's reputation." "We replace the bracket with the correct part," Marcus said. "Bypass the tampered wiring. Reset the fuel regulator manually." He glanced sideways at Tony. "You have a spare bracket in your kit that matches the original specification." Tony hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I might. From the backup parts inventory. I brought extras in case something needed replacing during transport." "Get it." Tony rose and jogged toward the equipment van parked near the service entrance, leaving Marcus alone beside the engine, with Clara still crouched close by, watching him work with an intensity that surprised even her. "You really think you can fix this?" she said softly. It wasn't quite a question anymore. "I know I can fix this," Marcus said, and for the first time all evening, something like quiet confidence bled fully into his voice, unguarded and certain. "The mechanical problem isn't complicated. It never was. Whoever did this wanted it to look complicated, wanted everyone to assume the car had simply failed. But sabotage always leaves a signature if you know how to read it." "How do you know how to read it?" Marcus paused, his hands stilling over the engine for just a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, quieter, carrying the particular weight of something rarely spoken aloud. "Because a long time ago, someone did the exact same thing to me." Clara's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Before Marcus could answer, a commotion rippled through the crowd near the mansion's side entrance. Daniel had reappeared, though not with the paperwork Clara had demanded. Instead, he walked briskly toward them with 2 uniformed estate security guards flanking him, his expression carefully arranged into something that resembled concern but sat too tightly across his features to be genuine. "Clara," Daniel called out as he approached. "I think it's best we escort this man off the property. He's clearly overstepped his role tonight, and frankly making unfounded accusations against estate staff could open us up to serious liability." The crowd's murmuring spiked sharply. Clara stood planting herself directly between Daniel and Marcus with a suddenness that startled even her own mother. "Escort him off the property," she repeated, incredulous. "He's the only person here who's actually found anything useful all night." "Clara, please be reasonable. We don't even know this man's background. For all we know, he planted that part himself to manufacture some kind of scene." The accusation landed like a slap. For the first time all evening, Marcus rose fully to his feet, standing at his full height, meeting Daniel's gaze without a trace of the deference the crowd had expected from him hours earlier. "I've worked at this estate for 3 years, Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "In that time, I have never once given you a reason to doubt my integrity. So before you accuse me of sabotaging a car I only touched 20 minutes ago, I'd ask you to consider who actually had unsupervised access to this vehicle after the final inspection was completed." Daniel's composure flickered just barely, but enough. "Are you accusing me of something?" I'm asking a question. This is outrageous. Daniel turned to Clara, his voice climbing with practiced indignation. Clara, I have worked for your family for 6 years. I was the one who found this restoration team. I was the one who managed every detail of tonight's event. And now, because a member of the household staff wants to play detective, I'm being accused in front of your entire guest list. Clara stared at him, something cold and clear crystallizing behind her eyes as she studied his face. Really studied it the way she should have studied it hours ago when the engine first refused to turn over. Nobody said your name until you brought it up yourself, Daniel. The courtyard went utterly silent. Bianca's phone had never been steadier, her voice dropping to a hushed, reverent whisper as she narrated the moment to her now nearly 80,000 live viewers. Oh my God, you guys, I think we're watching a real accusation happen right now. This is not a drill. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, visibly recalculating. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. I only meant that logically, given the timeline, it would make more sense that, "Where's the paperwork?" Clara interrupted, her voice flat and hard. "I'm sorry. The final inspection report, the one you went to retrieve 9 minutes ago. Where is it?" A muscle in Daniel's jaw twitched. "It's being located. The archive room is quite extensive and—" "You didn't go to the archive room," Marcus said quietly. "You went to make a phone call." Every head in the immediate vicinity turned toward Marcus. "How would you possibly know that—" Daniel snapped, his composure cracking further, the smoothness in his voice replaced by something sharper, more defensive. "Because I saw you," Marcus said, through the kitchen window, standing by the service stairwell, talking on your phone for nearly 6 minutes before you came back out with security guards instead of paperwork. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard Ashford, standing near the edge of the circle, folded his arms with an expression of grim, satisfied interest, as if he had just watched a particularly satisfying chess move unfold. Daniel's eyes darted toward Clara, then toward the 2 security guards flanking him, as if calculating his options in real time. "This is absurd," he said again, though his voice had lost most of its conviction. "I don't need to explain a private phone call to household staff." "You don't need to explain it to him," Clara said quietly. "You need to explain it to me." The silence that followed stretched long and taut, every guest in the courtyard leaning in, almost imperceptibly waiting. Then, breaking the tension entirely, Tony Reyes came jogging back from the equipment van, holding a small metal bracket triumphantly above his head. "Found it," he called out. "Exact spec match." The moment fractured attention splitting between Daniel's unraveling composure and the sudden hopeful possibility that the car might actually run again tonight. Clara felt the whiplash of it in her chest, hope and suspicion tangled together so tightly she could barely separate them. "Daniel," she said, her voice low and final. "We will finish this conversation after the car starts. Don't leave this courtyard." Daniel said nothing, but Clara noticed with a chill that settled deep into her bones the way his eyes flicked briefly toward the estate's front gate before he forced himself to remain still. Marcus knelt back down beside the engine, accepting the bracket from Tony, with a small nod of professional respect that hadn't existed between the 2 men an hour earlier. "This will take about 10 minutes, Marcus said. "Maybe less if nobody interrupts me again." "Take whatever time you need," Clara said, though her eyes remained fixed on Daniel, who stood rigid near the edge of the stage, flanked by security guards who seemed increasingly unsure whether they were meant to be protecting him or watching him. As Marcus worked carefully removing the tampered bracket and replacing it with the correct component, Richard Ashford drifted closer, once more crouching down beside him, with the easy familiarity of a man who had spent decades around engines exactly like this one. "You said someone did this to you once," Richard said quietly, low enough that only Marcus could hear him over the murmuring crowd. "Sabotaged your work. Ruined something you built." Marcus's hands didn't stop moving, but something in his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. "It was a long time ago." "How long?" 12 years. "And you never went back, never tried to reclaim whatever it was you lost." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working carefully around the fuel regulator, resetting the wiring Daniel's sabotage had corrupted. "Some doors don't open twice," he said finally. "Not for people who look like me, not in that world." Richard studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his sharp, calculating eyes. "That's a shame," he said quietly, "because whoever you were 12 years ago clearly knew exactly what they were doing. I've watched grown men with engineering degrees from Ivy League schools stare blankly at problems you solved in under an hour." Marcus didn't respond, his focus entirely on the delicate wiring beneath his fingers, though something in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the words. Clara, standing close enough to catch the exchange, felt something shift inside her chest, a slow, uncomfortable realization dawning. This man, the one she had passed in hallways 100 times without a second glance, the one she had just publicly, cruelly promised to marry as a joke in front of 250 of the wealthiest people in California, was not simply a handyman who happened to be good with tools. He was someone who had once been something far greater, and something or someone had taken it from him. "Marcus," she said quietly, kneeling down beside him despite the golden fabric of her gown pooling against the courtyard stones. "What happened 12 years ago?" Marcus's hands paused over the engine for the briefest moment. When he looked up at her, his expression carried none of the earlier calm certainty. Instead, there was something raw there, something old and carefully buried beneath years of quiet, deliberate distance. "Not tonight," he said softly. "Tonight, let's just get this car running." Clara wanted to press further, wanted to understand the strange magnetic pull she felt toward this man's carefully guarded history, but the sound of Daniel's raised voice cut through the moment before she could speak again. "This is ridiculous," Daniel snapped, apparently unable to maintain his composure any longer under the weight of the crowd's suspicious stares. "I refuse to stand here and be silently accused while some household employee plays mechanic for a crowd of gossiping strangers." "Then answer the question," Clara said, rising to her feet again, turning fully toward him. "Who did you call? That is none of your concern." "It is entirely my concern, Daniel. This is my father's car, my family's estate, my guest list you've been managing for 6 years. Her voice climbed sharp and clear enough to carry across the entire courtyard. "Who did you call?" For a moment, Daniel said nothing, his eyes darting once more toward the front gate, toward the security guards flanking him, toward Richard Ashford, watching with an expression that had shifted from amusement into something far more calculating. Then quietly, almost too quiet, to hear Richard spoke up from where he crouched beside the engine. "I think I might have an idea." Every head turned toward him. "There's only one buyer in Southern California who's been quietly asking around about this exact car for the last 3 months, Richard said, slowly rising to his feet, brushing off his trousers with deliberate calm. "Offering well below market value, mind you, on the assumption that the restoration would eventually fail, and the Whitmore family would be desperate enough to accept a lowball offer, just to be rid of the embarrassment." Clara felt her blood run cold. "Who?" Richard's eyes flicked toward Daniel, something hard and unforgiving settling into his expression. "Victor Callahan." The name meant nothing to Clara, but the reaction it produced in Daniel was unmistakable. His face drained of color so quickly that even the guards flanking him seemed to notice one of them instinctively stepping half a pace closer, as if anticipating that Daniel might attempt to bolt. "I don't know who that is," Daniel said, but his voice wavered, cracking under the weight of a lie too clumsy to hold up against the sudden sharp attention of an entire courtyard. "Funny," Richard said, folding his arms, "because Victor Callahan happens to be my former business partner. We had a falling out 3 years ago over a rather unsavory habit he developed of manufacturing his own good deals, sabotaging restorations, forcing desperate sellers into low-ball offers. I recognized his fingerprints on tonight's little disaster the moment I saw that aftermarket bracket." Gasps rippled through the crowd, louder, now sharper. The earlier mocking laughter entirely replaced by something closer to collective, horrified fascination. Bianca's livestream comments were scrolling so fast now that she'd stopped trying to read them aloud, simply holding her phone steady, with both hands, mouth slightly open. Clara turned slowly back toward Daniel, her voice dropping to something dangerously quiet. "You were going to sell my father's car to a man who deliberately destroys restorations. For what? A commission? A payoff?" "Clara, I can explain." "Explain it to my lawyers," Clara said. "Because right now, I want you off this property." Daniel's mask finally shattered entirely, 6 years of carefully cultivated charm crumbling into raw, desperate panic. "You don't understand the position I was in." he said, his voice climbing, almost pleading now. The estate's finances aren't what your father left them as. There were debts, obligations he never told you about. Callahan offered enough to cover everything quietly without ever exposing the family to public scrutiny. I was trying to protect you. By destroying my father's legacy. By keeping this family from bankruptcy. Daniel's voice cracked, echoing across the suddenly silent courtyard. You have no idea what I've been managing behind the scenes for the past 2 years. The renovations, the lawsuits, the staff salaries. Your father left this estate in far worse condition than anyone bothered to tell you, and I have spent every single day since his death trying to hold it together while you swan around signing checks you don't understand. The words landed like a physical blow. Clara staggered back half a step, her carefully composed expression finally cracking entirely years of practiced grace, giving way to raw, unguarded shock. That's not true, she whispered. Ask your accountants, Daniel said bitterly. Ask them why the maintenance budget has been slashed 3 times this year. Ask them why I've been quietly negotiating with 3 separate creditors for the last 8 months. I was trying to save this family, Clara, in the only way I knew how, and instead of thanking me, you're going to hand me over to your lawyers because some handyman decided to play detective. The courtyard held its breath. Clara turned slowly toward Marcus, still crouched beside the engine, his hands finally still over the completed repair, watching the unfolding confrontation with an expression of quiet, careful attentiveness. Is it true? She asked him, her voice small now, stripped of all its earlier authority. The financial trouble, is that even possible? Marcus rose slowly to his feet, wiping his hands on a cloth from his toolbox before answering. I wouldn't know about the estate's finances, he said carefully, but I can tell you this. A man managing genuine financial desperation doesn't sabotage the one asset capable of solving it. If this car had started tonight and sold at auction as intended, it would have brought in far more than any lowball offer from a private collector working outside the public market. He paused, his eyes hard now, fixed steadily on Daniel. No, this wasn't desperation. This was greed. Callahan wasn't just buying the car cheap. He was paying someone handsomely to make sure it stayed cheap. Daniel's face went rigid. How much did he pay you? Marcus asked quietly. To ruin 2 years of your employer's trust. To betray a family that gave you 6 years of steady work, and from everything I've seen tonight, more grace than you apparently deserved. Daniel said nothing. His jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped visibly along his cheek. Clara felt something inside her finally settle the shock and hurt of the last several minutes, hardening into something colder, clearer, more resolved than anything she had felt all evening. She turned to the security guards flanking Daniel. Escort him to the front gate, she said, her voice steady now, carrying easily across the silent courtyard. He is no longer permitted on this property. I'll be contacting the authorities within the hour. Clara? Don't. Her voice cracked like a whip, silencing him instantly. Don't you dare say my name again tonight. The guards moved forward, each taking one of Daniel's arms, and though he opened his mouth as if to protest further, something in Clara's expression must have convinced him the moment had passed beyond saving, because he simply allowed himself to be led away. His earlier smooth confidence entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, defeated posture of a man watching 6 years of careful deception collapse in a single evening. The crowd parted to let them through, murmurs rising into a low, constant hum as Daniel disappeared through the estate's front gate, flanked on either side by uniformed security. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Clara turned back toward the car, toward Marcus standing quietly beside the now repaired engine, and felt the full weight of the evening finally settle onto her shoulders. Her father's legacy, her family's reputation, a betrayal she never saw coming, uncovered entirely by a man she had dismissed as invisible for 3 years. Try it now, she said quietly. Tony slid into the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the ignition key, the entire courtyard holding its breath around him. He turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, caught for half a second, and then died again. A collective groan rippled through the crowd, disappointment and renewed uncertainty flooding back into the space where hope had briefly bloomed. Bianca's comment section exploded with confused frustration. Richard Ashford's earlier calculating interest sharpened into something closer to genuine concern. Clara turned sharply toward Marcus. "I thought you fixed it." "I fixed the sabotage," Marcus said, already crouching back down beside the engine, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But that sputter wasn't the bracket, that's something else." "Something else?" Clara's voice climbed with fresh panic. "What do you mean, something else?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. His fingers already moving deeper into the engine bay, tracing wires and connections with rapidly narrowing focus. His expression shifting from calm confidence into something sharper, more urgent. "There's a second problem," he said quietly. "And unless I'm wrong, whoever planted that first piece of sabotage wanted us to find it, wanted us to feel like we'd solved it." He looked up at Clara, his eyes dark with sudden dawning understanding. This was never meant to be fixed in one step. Clara's stomach dropped. "You're saying Daniel planted two separate problems?" "I'm saying," Marcus said slowly, "that whoever did this understood exactly how people think. They wanted us to find the obvious sabotage, celebrate the victory, and relax our guard just long enough to miss the second one." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And it's buried somewhere much harder to reach. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, unnoticed by everyone still focused on the stalled engine, a woman in a dark green dress lowered her phone after ending a brief hushed call, her eyes scanning the courtyard with quiet, calculating interest before slipping quietly through the side gate into the shadows beyond the estate's grounds. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, unnoticed by everyone still focused on the stalled engine, a woman in a dark green dress had already vanished into the shadows beyond the estate's grounds. Nobody saw her go. Nobody except for one person who happened to glance up at exactly the wrong moment and would spend the next hour wondering why her face felt so unsettlingly familiar. By 9:45, the courtyard had transformed into something closer to a crime scene than a celebration. Waiters stood frozen near the terrace with trays of untouched champagne, uncertain whether serving drinks during an unfolding scandal counted as appropriate hospitality. The string quartet had abandoned any pretense of playing at all their instruments, resting silently across their laps as they watched the same spectacle as everyone else. Marcus was elbow-deep in the engine bay again, his flashlight beam tracing a slow, methodical path along the wiring harness that fed the ignition system. Tony crouched beside him now, no longer the skeptical professional he'd been an hour earlier, but something closer to a genuine partner handing tools without being asked, anticipating Marcus's next move, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had finally recognized real expertise when he saw it. "There," Marcus said suddenly, his voice sharpening with focus. "Right there." "What is it?" Clara asked, crouching down beside him despite her mother's continued disapproving silence a few feet away. "Somebody cut into the ignition timing wire and spliced it back together," Marcus said, angling his flashlight so Clara could see the faint discoloration along the insulation, a seam so small it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for exactly that kind of damage. "It's not broken, it's rewired. Deliberately so, it would only fail under specific conditions." "What conditions?" "Heat," Marcus said grimly. "The engine ran fine on the very first attempt, remember? Before it sat idling under those stage lights for 20 minutes. This splice was built to fail after sustained heat exposure. Whoever did this didn't just want the car to not start. They wanted it to almost start, get everyone's hopes up, and then die again in the most humiliating way possible." Clara felt something cold settle behind her ribs. "That's not just sabotage, that's cruelty." "That's precision," Marcus said quietly. "Somebody who understood exactly how public humiliation works. Somebody who wanted this exact moment, wanted you standing here in front of 250 guests, desperate and embarrassed right before they made you an offer you'd be too exhausted to refuse." Richard Ashford, still lingering nearby with his scotch now entirely abandoned on a nearby table, folded his arms and exhaled slowly. "That's Callahan's signature move," he said. "I've seen it 3 times now. Auctions where the seller's prize piece mysteriously fails right before bidding opens, driving the price down to nothing, and Callahan swoops in looking like a savior instead of a vulture." 3 times? Clara turned toward him sharply. "You've seen this exact thing happen before. Once with a Bugatti in Monaco, once with a Duesenberg outside Chicago. Both times the sellers were desperate enough by the time Callahan made his offer that they signed without asking too many questions. Richard's expression darkened. I always suspected foul play. I never had proof. Not until tonight. Bianca's live stream had climbed past 90,000 viewers, the comment section moving so fast now that individual messages blurred together into a constant scrolling wall of shock and outrage. Someone call the police. This is literally a crime. Is this real life? I've never seen anything like this. Who is this handyman? 9 minutes, Marcus said, suddenly glancing at his watch. That's roughly how long it took the engine to overheat and fail the first time. If I splice this correctly, we might get one clean attempt before we know whether this actually works. And if it doesn't work? Clara asked. Marcus met her eyes steadily. Then we find the third problem if there is one. And the fourth if we have to. I'm not walking away from this car tonight. Something about the certainty in his voice settled a small, unexpected warmth into Clara's chest, cutting through the panic and humiliation that had gripped her for the better part of an hour. She didn't fully understand why his confidence affected her the way it did, but she found herself nodding, trusting him in a way she hadn't trusted anyone all evening. Not her mother, not Daniel, not even the professional mechanics. She'd paid a small fortune to guarantee tonight's success. Do it, she said quietly. Marcus bent back to the wiring, his hands moving with the same careful, unhurried precision that had first caught Clara's attention an hour earlier. Around them, the crowd had begun to press closer again, drawn back by the electric tension in the air, the sense that something enormous was building toward release. 10:42 p.m. Eleanor Whitmore, who had retreated to the edge of the stage in visible distress, finally found her voice again, though it came out smaller than her earlier sharpness, cracked at the edges in a way Clara had rarely heard from her mother. Clara, Eleanor said quietly, stepping close enough that only her daughter could hear. Is it true what Daniel said about the finances? Clara turned to face her mother, fully exhaustion and grief and fury tangled together behind her eyes. I don't know, Mother. I've never once looked at the actual books. Daniel always handled that. Daddy trusted him completely. Your father trusted a great many people, Eleanor said softly, and look where that trust has led us tonight. Did you know? Clara asked, her voice suddenly sharp again, cutting through her own exhaustion. About debts, about creditors. Did you know any of this before tonight? Eleanor's silence lasted just a beat too long. Mother, there were conversations, Eleanor admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Vague ones. Daniel mentioned once or twice that certain expenses had grown difficult to manage. I assumed it was ordinary estate maintenance. I never imagined... She stopped, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. I never imagined he was orchestrating something like this. Clara felt something inside her chest crack wide open. Grief for her father tangling with fresh, raw betrayal at discovering that even her mother had known pieces of a puzzle she herself had been kept entirely blind to. How much, Mother? How much money are we actually talking about? I don't know the exact figure. Millions, perhaps. Enough that Daniel insisted we needed to be, in his words, strategic about which assets we chose to hold on to. Strategic? Clara repeated bitterly. Is that what he called selling my father's legacy to a criminal for pennies on the dollar? Before Eleanor could respond, Marcus's voice cut through the tension. Try it now. Tony slid back into the driver's seat, his hand trembling slightly around the ignition key. The entire courtyard seemed to inhale as one collective breath, 250 guests leaning forward in perfect silent unison. Tony turned the key. The engine roared to life. For 3 glorious seconds, the deep, throaty rumble of the restored roadster echoed across the courtyard, and the crowd erupted into spontaneous, thunderous applause, relief and astonishment crashing together into pure, unrestrained joy. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, her hands flying to her mouth as she watched the engine that had humiliated her for over an hour finally roar exactly the way her father had always promised it would. Then, at the 4-second mark, the engine sputtered violently and died again. The applause died with it, replaced by a groan of collective disappointment, so loud it seemed to shake the courtyard itself. No! Clara whispered, her joy collapsing instantly into fresh despair. No, no, please. Marcus was already back at the engine, his jaw tight, his earlier calm giving way to something sharper, more urgent. There's definitely a third component, he muttered mostly to himself, his hands moving rapidly now, tracing every wire, every connection, every possible point of failure, with a focus so intense it seemed to blot out the disappointed murmuring of the crowd around him. Richard crouched down beside him again, his voice dropping low. You said Callahan's signature move involves multiple layers of failure. How many layers does he usually build in? 3, Marcus said grimly, still working. Always 3. One obvious enough to find quickly and feel triumphant about. One hidden well enough to seem like bad luck instead of sabotage. And one buried so deep that by the time you find it, you've already exhausted every ounce of patience, money, and dignity you had left. Then we're looking for the third one right now. We're looking for it, Marcus agreed, and we're running out of time to find it before this crowd gives up entirely, and Callahan gets exactly the humiliated, desperate seller he was counting on. 11:03 p.m. A commotion near the front gate drew Clara's attention away from the engine for the first time in several minutes. She turned to see 2 estate security guards escorting a well-dressed man through the entrance, a man Clara had never seen before in her life, silver-haired, impeccably tailored, with the kind of unbothered predatory calm that immediately set every hair on the back of her neck standing upright. Mr. Whitmore's estate, the man said smoothly, addressing no one in particular, as he strolled toward the gathered crowd with the casual confidence of someone who owned the room simply by entering it. I do apologize for the late arrival. I heard there might be some difficulty with tonight's centerpiece, and I thought perhaps I could offer my assistance. Richard Ashford's entire body went rigid. Callahan, he hissed low enough that only those closest to him could hear. Clara felt her blood run cold. You, she said, stepping forward, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. You're Victor Callahan. The man's smile widened, unbothered by the venom in her tone. I am indeed. Victor Callahan at your service. I understand you've had quite the evening, Ms. Whitmore. Mechanical failures can be so terribly stressful, especially in front of such distinguished company. His eyes swept the courtyard with obvious calculated pleasure, cataloging the wreckage of her evening, like a man surveying a battlefield he'd personally engineered. I happen to have significant experience with difficult restorations. Perhaps I could take this troublesome vehicle off your hands, save you further embarrassment. How did you even know to come here tonight? Clara demanded. Callahan's smile didn't waver. Word travels quickly in certain circles, my dear. Daniel called you, Marcus said, not looking up from the engine, his voice flat and certain. 9 minutes after the car first failed. That's who he was talking to on the phone before he came back with security guards instead of paperwork. Callahan's eyes flicked toward Marcus, for the first time something cold and assessing passing behind his gaze. And who exactly is this, the man who's been undoing everything you paid Daniel to build tonight? Richard said, stepping forward, his earlier scotch-soaked amusement entirely replaced by hard, focused anger. Victor, you have some nerve showing your face here after Monaco, after Chicago. Richard, Callahan's smile finally flickered just barely. Still bitter about our little falling out, I see. Bitter isn't the word I'd use for discovering. My former business partner has spent 3 years sabotaging desperate sellers for profit. Allegations, Callahan said smoothly, require evidence, Richard, and I don't see any here tonight. Just a broken car and a household employee playing amateur detective. We have the bracket, Clara said, her voice shaking with fury now. The aftermarket part someone planted inside this engine. We have Daniel's confession that he's been working with you for months. We have Richard's testimony about your previous identical schemes. None of which, Callahan said, his voice cooling into something harder beneath its polished veneer, would hold up particularly well in court against a man with my resources and my legal team. I'd think carefully, Ms. Whitmore, before making accusations you'll struggle to substantiate. Bianca's live stream, still broadcasting the entire exchange to now well over 100,000 viewers, captured every word with crystal clarity, the comment section erupting into a fresh wave of fury. This guy is unhinged. Someone screenshot everything he just said. He's literally threatening her on camera. Clara felt something shift inside her, the exhaustion and grief of the evening finally hardening into something unshakable. She stepped closer to Callahan, close enough that he seemed for the first time faintly uncertain beneath his unbothered composure. "You're standing on my family's property," she said, her voice low and dangerously steady, having just admitted in front of 100,000 live witnesses that you had prior knowledge of a mechanical failure you conveniently arrived to profit from. "I don't need a courtroom tonight, Mr. Callahan. I just need my security team to escort you off this estate before I call the police myself." For the briefest moment, something like genuine alarm flickered behind Callahan's eyes. Then just as quickly, his composure slid back into place, smooth and unbothered. "Very well," he said, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate calm. "I'll leave you to your little mechanical crisis, Ms. Whitmore. Though I suspect before the night is through, you'll wish you'd taken my offer while it was still on the table." He turned and strode back toward the front gate, unhurried, unbothered, disappearing into the darkness beyond the estate's grounds, with the same predatory calm he'd arrived with, leaving Clara standing rigid in his wake, her hands trembling with adrenaline and fury. "He'll be back," Richard said quietly, watching him go. "Men like Callahan don't walk away from an investment this large without a fight." "Let him try," Clara said, though her voice carried less certainty than she intended. 11:21 p.m. Marcus straightened up suddenly from the engine bay, a small corroded component pinched between his fingers, his expression sharpening into something close to triumph. "Found it," he said. "The third piece." The crowd, which had begun drifting toward exhaustion and disappointment after Callahan's dramatic appearance and departure, surged forward again, drawn by the sudden shift in Marcus's energy. "What is it?" Clara asked, crouching beside him. "A corroded relay switch," Marcus said, holding it up for her to see. "Except it's not corroded from age. It's been deliberately exposed to some kind of acidic compound. Somebody wanted it to look like natural decay, but real corrosion doesn't happen this uniformly. This was chemically accelerated." "How long would something like that take to plan?" "Weeks," Marcus said grimly. This wasn't a rushed job. Whoever did this had access to the car during the final stages of restoration, planned 3 separate points of failure with surgical precision, and waited until the worst possible moment to let it all unravel. He paused, his jaw tightening. "This is professional work, Clara. Whoever actually installed these components wasn't Daniel. Daniel doesn't strike me as someone who understands engines well enough to pull this off himself." "Then who?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, turning the corroded relay switch over in his fingers, studying it with an intensity that seemed to carry weight far beyond the immediate mechanical puzzle in front of him. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I intend to find out." Tony, still crouched nearby, cleared his throat hesitantly. "There's something else you should probably know," he said, glancing between Marcus and Clara with visible discomfort. "About 3 weeks ago, a woman came by the restoration facility, said she was a journalist doing a piece on high-value vintage restorations, asked a lot of very specific technical questions about the fuel system, the ignition timing. I thought it was strange at the time, but she had press credentials, so I let her look around for maybe 20 minutes. Clara felt her stomach drop. "What did she look like?" Tony hesitated. "Dark hair. Green dress, if I remember right, though obviously she wasn't wearing that at the facility. Sharp eyes, very polished, very confident." "Green dress," Clara repeated slowly, a memory suddenly surfacing sharp and unsettling. "I saw a woman in a dark green dress earlier tonight, standing near the back of the crowd. She left right after the second sabotage was discovered." Marcus's expression darkened considerably. "So we're not just dealing with Daniel and Callahan," he said. "We're dealing with someone technically skilled enough to plant 3 separate points of sabotage over the course of several weeks. Someone who had legitimate enough credentials to gain access to a highly secured restoration facility, and someone who was here tonight watching this entire disaster unfold from inside the crowd." "That's not possible," Eleanor said, her voice faint with disbelief. "We vetted every single guest on tonight's list personally." "Then she wasn't on the guest list," Marcus said quietly, "which means somebody let her in." The implication hung heavy in the air, and Clara felt the last remaining shred of security from the evening crumble entirely beneath her feet. Not just Daniel, not just Callahan. A third person, technically skilled, deliberately hidden, moving through her family's most private, guarded event with complete impunity. I need to see the guest check-in logs, Clara said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Immediately. Eleanor gestured to one of the remaining household staff, who hurried off toward the mansion's front office, returning several minutes later with a tablet displaying the evening's digital check-in records. Clara scrolled through the list with trembling fingers, scanning name after name, searching for any unfamiliar entry, any hint of the woman Tony had described. "There," Marcus said, suddenly pointing to an entry near the bottom of the list. "Guest of Daniel Cross, checked in at 8:50 p.m., roughly 25 minutes before the car first failed to start." Clara stared at the name listed beside the entry. Vanessa Rourke. "Do you recognize that name?" she asked, looking around at the small circle gathered near the engine. Richard's face had gone pale. "Vanessa Rourke," he repeated slowly, something like genuine shock cracking through his earlier composed anger. "I know that name." "From where?" "She used to work for Callahan," Richard said quietly. "Years ago, before I severed ties with him. She was his technical consultant, brought in specifically for high-value mechanical sabotage jobs. I always suspected she was involved in the Monaco incident, but I never had proof." He looked up, his expression grim. If Vanessa Rourke was here tonight planting sabotage in this engine, that means Callahan didn't just show up opportunistically after the fact. He orchestrated this entire evening from the very beginning, weeks in advance, with Daniel feeding him inside information the whole time. Clara felt the full weight of the conspiracy settling over her like a physical burden. Not a single betrayal, but 3 interlocking betrayals planned and executed with a level of coordination that made her earlier grief over Daniel's involvement feel almost naive by comparison. "How could this happen?" she whispered mostly to herself. "How could I not see any of this coming?" Marcus, still crouched beside the engine, looked up at her with something gentle and steady in his expression, cutting through the spiraling panic, threatening to overwhelm her. "Because you trusted the people closest to you," he said quietly. "That's not a weakness, Clara. That's what decent people do. The failure isn't yours. It belongs entirely to the people who exploited that trust." Something in his words settled over her like a steadying hand, and for a moment amid the wreckage of the evening, Clara found herself simply looking at him, really looking, seeing not the handyman she'd walked past 100 times without a second glance, but someone whose quiet steadiness had somehow become the only stable ground left beneath her feet. "Can you fix it?" she asked softly. "The relay switch. Can you fix it tonight?" Marcus nodded already, reaching into his toolbox for a replacement component. "Give me 15 minutes, 11:47 p.m. As Marcus worked carefully installing the replacement relay and testing each connection with methodical precision, Richard Ashford pulled out his phone, dialing a number with the sharp, decisive urgency of a man calling in a long overdue debt. "Marcus," Richard said, waiting for his call to connect. "You mentioned earlier that something similar happened to you once, 12 years ago." He paused, watching Marcus's hand still briefly over the engine. "I have a suspicion about who might have been involved in what happened to you back then. And if I'm right, the timing lines up in a way I don't think is coincidental." Marcus looked up sharply. "What are you talking about?" "The racing scandal," Richard said quietly. 12 years ago. A championship engine failure. A young engineer blamed for a mistake he didn't make. He watched Marcus's face carefully, gauging his reaction. "I know that story, Marcus. Everyone in the industry knew that story at the time, and I always thought the official explanation didn't add up." Clara felt her breath catch, watching Marcus's expression shift from focused concentration into something far more vulnerable, more exposed than she had seen from him all evening. "How do you know about that?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "Because," Richard said grimly, his phone still ringing against his ear, "the man who ran that racing team 12 years ago, the one who publicly blamed a talented young black engineer for a failure that wasn't his fault, was the same man who later became Victor Callahan's primary business partner in the vintage restoration industry." He paused, letting the words land fully. "I think, Marcus, that tonight isn't just about a car. I think tonight is about you finally getting a chance to face the man who destroyed your career 12 years ago." The courtyard around them seemed to fade into stunned silence as the implications of Richard's words settled over everyone close enough to hear them. Marcus stood slowly, the replacement relay switch forgotten in his hand, his expression caught somewhere between shock and a dawning furious realization 12 years in the making. Who, Marcus said, his voice low and dangerously controlled, ran that racing team? Richard's call connected at that exact moment, and he held up a single finger, listening intently to whoever had answered on the other end. His face, already pale with tension, drained further as he absorbed whatever information was being relayed to him. "Say that again," Richard said into the phone, his voice tight. A pause. "You're certain?" Another pause, longer this time. Richard lowered the phone slowly, his eyes lifting to meet Marcus's, with an expression of grim, dawning horror. "That was my associate at the Racing Commission archives," he said quietly. "I asked her to pull the ownership records for the team you worked for 12 years ago, the one that blamed you for that championship failure." He drew a slow breath. "The majority stakeholder in that racing team, Marcus, the man who personally signed off on your termination, still holds a controlling financial interest in several of Callahan's current restoration ventures." Clara felt the courtyard tilt slightly around her, the sheer scale of the conspiracy expanding beyond anything she could have imagined an hour earlier. Not just Daniel, not just Callahan, not just Vanessa Rourke. A fourth figure, now someone who had apparently been quietly destroying Marcus's career and profiting from schemes exactly like tonight's for over a decade. "Who is it?" Marcus said again, his voice barely above a whisper now, though it carried a raw, dangerous edge that silenced everyone nearby. Richard hesitated, glancing briefly at Clara before answering, as if weighing the full weight of what he was about to reveal. "Marcus," he said slowly, "the man who destroyed your career 12 years ago, the same man secretly financing Victor Callahan's sabotage operation tonight, is Whitmore Heritage's original founding investor, a man your late employer Charles Whitmore trusted enough to name as executor of this very estate's automotive collection should anything ever happen to him." The words hit the courtyard like a physical blow, and Clara felt her entire understanding of the evening collapse and reassemble around a single devastating question that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. "That's not possible," she whispered. "My father's automotive executor retired years ago. He hasn't had any involvement with the estate since before Daddy passed away." Richard's expression remained grim, unwavering. "Are you certain about that, Clara? Or is that simply what you were told?" Before Clara could respond, a new voice cut through the tense silence, smooth, familiar, and utterly unexpected, coming from the shadows near the estate's side entrance, where the mansion's private study opened onto the courtyard. "I'm afraid," the voice said, calm and measured, stepping slowly into the golden light, "that Richard's information, while impressively thorough, is only telling half the story." Every head in the courtyard turned at once. Standing in the doorway, dressed impeccably, despite the late hour, was a silver-haired man Clara recognized instantly, though the sight of him standing there sent an icy jolt of confusion straight through her chest. "Uncle Theodore," she whispered. Theodore Whitmore, her father's younger brother, the man who had quietly stepped back from all estate involvement years before his brother's death, citing health concerns and a desire for peaceful retirement, stood in the doorway with an expression of calm, unbothered patience that made Clara's blood run instantly, unmistakably cold. "Hello, Clara," Theodore said softly, his eyes drifting past her toward Marcus, lingering there with an expression that carried none of the surprise anyone else in the courtyard felt. "It's been a long time, Mr. Bennett. You've grown quite skilled since our last encounter." Marcus went absolutely still, his eyes locking onto Theodore's face with an intensity that seemed to draw every ounce of oxygen from the surrounding air. "You," Marcus said, his voice a low, controlled tremor of 12 years of buried, unresolved fury. "It was you." "You," Marcus said again, his voice a low, controlled tremor of 12 years of buried, unresolved fury. "It was you." Theodore Whitmore stepped fully into the golden light of the courtyard, his hands folded calmly in front of him. his expression carrying the mild, unbothered patience of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times in his head, and found now that it had finally arrived that reality disappointed him slightly less than he'd feared. "It's remarkable," Theodore said, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "How much a man can change in 12 years, and how much underneath it all he can stay exactly the same." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her entirely. Her uncle's calm, familiar voice suddenly sounding like something foreign, something she had never truly heard before, despite 29 years of holiday dinners and birthday visits. "Uncle Theodore," she said, her voice shaking, "what is he talking about? What did you do to this man?" Theodore's gaze finally shifted away from Marcus, landing on his niece, with something that almost resembled fondness, though it curdled instantly into something colder the longer he held her stare. "Sit down, Clara. This is a longer story than you're prepared for tonight." "I don't want to sit down. I want an answer." "Very well." Theodore sighed, the sound carrying none of the guilt Clara desperately wanted to hear in it. 12 years ago, I was the majority stakeholder in a racing team that Marcus here worked for as lead mechanical designer. Brilliant young man, genuinely brilliant. His engine designs were 3 years ahead of anything else on the circuit. "Then why did you destroy his career?" "Because," Theodore said simply, as if the answer were obvious, "brilliance in the wrong hands threatens the wrong people." Marcus's designs made older, more established engineers, men with decades of tenure and considerably more political weight within the organization, look obsolete overnight. When the championship engine failed during the final race, an engine, I should add, that Marcus had personally warned the team about 3 separate times in writing, it became remarkably convenient to let the blame fall somewhere it wouldn't disrupt the existing hierarchy. "You blamed an innocent man to protect your own investments," Clara said, horror creeping into her voice. "I protected the team's ability to secure future sponsorships," Theodore corrected mildly. "Sponsors do not respond well to internal chaos, Clara. They respond to clean, simple narratives. A young engineer making a costly mistake was a far more digestible story than admitting our senior staff had ignored explicit warnings from someone they considered beneath their attention." Marcus's hands had curled into fists at his sides, 12 years of carefully buried anger finally surfacing in the rigid set of his jaw, the barely controlled tremor in his voice. "I lost everything," he said quietly. "My reputation, my career. Every relationship I'd built in that industry evaporated overnight because you needed a scapegoat who wouldn't fight back." "And yet," Theodore said, tilting his head slightly, studying Marcus with something almost like curiosity, "here you are, 12 years later, still fixing engines just for considerably less money and considerably less recognition. I wonder, Mr. Bennett, do you regret not fighting harder back then?" "I fought," Marcus said, his voice rising for the first time all evening, sharp and raw. "I fought for 6 months, filed complaints, requested independent reviews. Every single door I knocked on belonged to someone who owed you a favor, or feared you, or simply didn't believe a black engineer's word carried the same weight as yours. So, no, I didn't stop fighting because I gave up. I stopped fighting because the fight had already been rigged before it started." The courtyard had gone utterly silent. Every guest, every reporter, every live stream viewer holding their breath as the confrontation unfolded in real time. Bianca's phone remained perfectly steady, though her voice, when she finally whispered an update to her audience, trembled audibly. "You guys, I don't even know what to say right now. This is not a party anymore. This is something else entirely." Richard Ashford stepped forward, his expression hardening into something Clara had never seen from him before. All traces of his earlier scotch-soaked amusement burned away entirely. "Theodore," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "how long have you been financing Callahan's operation?" Theodore's composure flickered for the first time, a small crack appearing in his carefully maintained calm. "Richard, I wondered when you'd arrive at that particular question." "How long?" 8 years, Theodore said finally, apparently deciding that further denial had become pointless given the growing circle of witnesses surrounding him. Victor approached me shortly after his falling out with you. He had the operational skill for identifying vulnerable sellers, and I had capital that needed to remain, shall we say, discreetly deployed. It's been a remarkably profitable partnership. You've been sabotaging vintage restorations for 8 years, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, the full scope of her uncle's betrayal settling over her like a physical weight. How many families have you destroyed? How many sellers did you force into desperate lowball sales? Nobody was forced into anything, Clara. Every transaction was entirely voluntary. Voluntary, Marcus repeated bitterly. The way tonight was voluntary, sabotaging a car in front of 250 guests, forcing a grieving woman to watch her father's legacy humiliated publicly, hoping she'd be desperate enough to accept any offer just to end the embarrassment. Theodore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Business requires leverage, Mr. Bennett. Surely a man of your considerable if underutilized talents understands that concept. And my father, Clara said, her voice climbing, now raw fury finally breaking through 29 years of practiced composure. Was he part of your business too, Uncle Theodore? Did you sabotage his health as easily as you sabotage engines? Did you— Clara, Eleanor's voice cut through sharply, horrified. That's enough. Is it, Mother? Clara rounded on her tears, finally spilling freely down her cheeks. Because I am done being told to stay composed, to smile wider, to save face, while everyone around me apparently knew things about this family that I was never permitted to hear. Theodore held up a hand, his expression shifting into something almost offended. I had nothing to do with your father's passing, Clara. Whatever else you think of me tonight, your father died of natural causes, and I loved my brother far too much to ever entertain such an accusation. Then why, Clara said, her voice breaking, would you do this to his legacy, to his car, to me? For the first time all evening, something genuine flickered behind Theodore's careful composure, a fraction of hesitation quickly smoothed over, but not entirely erased. Because, he said slowly, your father's estate holds assets worth considerably more than either of you have ever bothered to properly value. This car alone, sold correctly through the right private channels rather than a public auction driving up sentimental bidding wars, could have quietly funneled significant capital toward ventures your father would never have personally approved. Ventures I have spent years cultivating, ventures that require discretion. Your father's very public, very sentimental approach to this family's legacy consistently threatened. You're talking about my father's memory like it's an inconvenience, Clara said, disgust flooding her voice. I'm talking about it, Theodore said coolly, like the asset it always was. Your father built an empire on sentiment, Clara. Beautiful, admirable sentiment that made for wonderful magazine profiles and charitable galas. But sentiment doesn't scale. Sentiment doesn't compound. I have spent decades building something considerably more durable underneath the surface of this family's public image, and I will not apologize for protecting it. Richard shook his head slowly, disbelief and disgust warring across his features. You corrupted an entire industry, Theodore. Destroyed careers, manipulated grieving families, all to fund whatever quiet empire you've been building in the shadows. And you stand here justifying it like a business strategy. Because it is a business strategy, Theodore said simply. One that has functioned flawlessly for 8 years, precisely because nobody ever looked closely enough to notice. His eyes shifted back toward Marcus, something almost regretful passing behind them. Which brings me to my genuine miscalculation tonight. I never anticipated that Charles's daughter would happen to employ the one person on this entire estate skilled enough to see past the surface of what should have been an untraceable mechanical failure. You didn't know Marcus worked here, Clara said, slowly understanding dawning. I knew Marcus Bennett existed somewhere in this world, still alive, still presumably struggling to rebuild whatever remained of his career after our unfortunate history together, Theodore admitted. I did not know until roughly 90 minutes ago that he had been quietly employed at my own brother's estate for the past 3 years, invisible to everyone who should have recognized precisely how dangerous his skill set remained. He offered Marcus a small, humorless smile. You have my genuine, if belated, respect, Mr. Bennett. I underestimated you 12 years ago, and I underestimated you again tonight. That is a mistake I intend never to repeat. "There won't be a third time," Marcus said, his voice low and absolutely certain, "because after tonight, everyone in this industry is going to know exactly what you did. To me, to every family Callahan targeted on your behalf, to Clara." Theodore's calm finally cracked entirely, something colder and more dangerous surfacing beneath his composed exterior. "And how precisely do you intend to prove any of this, Mr. Bennett?" "You have a corroded relay switch and an aftermarket bracket. Circumstantial evidence easily explained away by a competent legal team, which I assure you I possess in considerable abundance." "We have more than that," Richard said, stepping forward, his phone still gripped tightly in his hand. "We have Vanessa Rourke's guest registration tying her directly to Daniel's invitation. We have Daniel's confession on live stream in front of over 100,000 witnesses admitting he contacted Callahan the moment this car first failed. We have your own admission just now, also broadcast live, confirming an 8-year partnership funding deliberate industry sabotage." He held up his phone, its screen still displaying Bianca's ongoing broadcast, the viewer count now soaring past 130,000. "Theodore, I don't think you fully appreciate how thoroughly you've just incriminated yourself in front of an audience considerably larger than any courtroom." The color drained slowly from Theodore's face as the reality of his exposure settled fully into place. His eyes darted briefly toward the phone, toward the small red recording indicator blinking steadily in the corner of Bianca's screen, and for the first time all evening, something like genuine panic flickered behind his composed exterior. "Turn that off," Theodore said sharply, taking a step toward Bianca. "Don't you dare!" Clara said, stepping directly into his path, her earlier grief hardening instantly into something fierce and protective. "You don't get to silence anyone else tonight, Uncle Theodore. Not after everything you've already taken." "Clara, you don't understand the scope of what you're threatening to unravel." "I understand perfectly," Clara said, her voice steady now, despite the tears still tracking down her cheeks. "You destroyed an innocent man's career to protect your own investments. You've spent 8 years profiting from other families' desperation, and tonight you tried to do the exact same thing to me in my own home, in front of everyone who ever trusted this family's name." She drew a shaking breath, drawing herself up to her full height. "I am not going to protect you the way this industry protected you 12 years ago." Theodore stared at his niece for a long silent moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Calculation and something that might have been genuine belated regret tangled together in a way Clara couldn't quite parse. Then abruptly, he turned toward the estate's front gate, his earlier composure reassembling itself with practiced, chilling speed. "This conversation isn't finished," he said, his voice regaining its cold, measured control. "You'll find, Clara, that unraveling 8 years of carefully structured business relationships tends to have consequences considerably more complicated than a single dramatic evening can resolve." "Is that a threat?" Marcus asked quietly, stepping forward until he stood directly between Theodore and the gate. Theodore's eyes flicked toward him, something almost respectful, almost rueful, passing behind his gaze. "It's a fact, Mr. Bennett. One I suspect you understand better than anyone here tonight, given how thoroughly the industry closed ranks against you 12 years ago." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "Careers can be destroyed with a single phone call. I should know. I've made several." "Try it," Marcus said, his voice utterly steady, 12 years of buried fury finally finding a controlled, unshakable outlet. "Try destroying me again in front of this many witnesses with this much evidence already public. See how far that phone call gets you this time." For a long, tense moment, Theodore simply stared at him, some final calculation playing out behind his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked briskly toward the front gate, disappearing into the darkness beyond the estate's grounds, much the way Callahan had less than an hour earlier, leaving behind a courtyard full of stunned, silent witnesses and a scandal that had already spread to well over 130,000 live viewers. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Eleanor, standing rigid near the edge of the stage, finally broke the silence with a small, broken sound that might have been a sob. 29 years, she whispered. "I've known that man for 29 years, and I never once suspected." Clara turned toward her mother, exhaustion and grief finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had carried her through the last 2 hours. "None of us suspected, Mother. That's exactly how he wanted it." Marcus, still standing near the engine, watched the exchange between mother and daughter with a complicated expression. 12 years of vindication tangled with something raw, something that hadn't fully processed the enormity of what had just happened. Richard approached him quietly, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "You did it," Richard said softly. "After 12 years, you finally exposed him." "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would," Marcus admitted, his voice quiet, almost startled by the admission. "I always imagined this moment would feel like victory, like relief." "And how does it feel?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the front gate where Theodore had disappeared. "Exhausting," he said finally. "Like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that I don't quite know how to stand without its weight anymore." Clara, overhearing the exchange, stepped closer, her earlier composure fully dissolved, now replaced by something raw and unguarded. "Marcus," she said softly, "I owe you an apology far beyond anything I could ever properly express tonight." "You don't owe me anything, Clara." "I do." She shook her head firmly. "I've walked past you in these hallways for 3 years, thanked you absently for fixing things I never once thought to ask you about, never once wondered who you actually were beneath the uniform I barely registered. Tonight, in front of 250 guests, I made you the punchline of a cruel joke because it was easier than admitting I had no idea how to save my father's legacy myself." Her voice broke slightly. "And you saved it anyway, even after everything I said, even after everyone laughed at you." Marcus studied her for a long moment, something gentle finally softening the exhausted lines around his eyes. "I didn't do this for you, Clara. Not at first. I did it because that engine deserved to run the way it was built to run, because your father clearly loved that car enough to spend the final years of his life restoring it properly, and because I recognized the particular signature of sabotage the moment I saw that first mismatched bracket." He paused. "But somewhere between finding the second problem and confronting Theodore just now, it did become about you too. About watching you refuse to back down even when everyone around you seemed to have already decided how tonight would end." Clara felt fresh tears gathering, though these carried something warmer than the grief and humiliation of the earlier evening. "The car still isn't running," she said softly, glancing toward the silent engine. Marcus followed her gaze, something determined settling back into his expression. "Then let's finish what we started." Tony, who had remained quietly nearby throughout the entire confrontation, cleared his throat gently. "The relay switch is installed. If Marcus is right that Theodore's people only built in 3 points of failure, we should be clear to try again." "And if there's a fourth?" Clara asked. "Then we'll find it," Marcus said simply. "Same as we found the first 3. Clara nodded, drawing a steadying breath, and gestured for Tony to try the ignition one final time. The remaining crowd considerably thinned now after the departures of Daniel Callahan and Theodore, but still numbering well over 200 deeply invested guests pressed forward once more, the earlier mocking energy entirely replaced by something closer to reverent anticipation. Tony turned the key. The engine roared to life, deep and steady, the powerful rumble echoing across the courtyard, exactly the way Charles Whitmore had always promised his daughter it would. This time, it did not falter. It did not sputter. It simply ran strong and unwavering, filling the night air with the sound of a legacy finally fully restored. The courtyard erupted. Applause thundered across the estate grounds, guests rising to their feet in spontaneous, overwhelming celebration. The earlier cruel laughter entirely transformed into something genuine and unrestrained. Bianca, tears streaming openly down her face, despite her earlier giggling excitement, turned her phone toward the roaring engine, her voice cracking with emotion as she addressed her now nearly 150,000 live viewers. "You guys," she said, barely able to speak through her tears. "I think we just watched history happen tonight. I think we just watched something absolutely incredible happen." Clara stood frozen for a moment, staring at the running engine, tears streaming freely down her face as 2 years of grief and one devastating evening of betrayal finally gave way to something she hadn't expected to feel again so completely. Relief, pride, and beneath it all, something that felt remarkably unexpectedly close to hope. She turned toward Marcus, who stood watching her with quiet, careful attention, his own eyes suspiciously bright in the golden courtyard light. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," Marcus corrected gently. Richard Ashford, wiping his own eyes with visible embarrassment, stepped forward and extended his hand toward Marcus with genuine, unguarded respect. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice thick with emotion he clearly hadn't expected to feel tonight. "In 40 years of this industry, I have never witnessed anything remotely close to what you accomplished here. I don't know what circumstances led you to spend the last 12 years fixing light fixtures instead of championship engines, but I intend to spend considerable effort ensuring that particular injustice doesn't continue one day longer." Marcus shook his offered hand, something cautiously hopeful flickering behind his exhausted eyes for the first time all evening. "I appreciate that, Mr. Ashford, though tonight isn't really about my career." "Isn't it?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm standing tonight, looks like the beginning of exactly that." Clara, still standing close beside Marcus, felt her earlier reckless promise suddenly resurface in her mind, the words she'd spoken hours earlier, in bitter, humiliated desperation, now carrying a weight she could never have anticipated when she first spoke them. "Fix it, and I'll marry you." The crowd around them, having witnessed every twist of the evening's astonishing unraveling, seemed to remember the promise at exactly the same moment, murmurs rippling through the courtyard, as guests turned expectantly toward Clara, waiting to see whether the night's most outrageous joke might somehow impossibly become its final, defining truth. Clara felt her face flush, suddenly acutely aware of the 100,000 strangers watching through Bianca's still-active live stream, aware of her mother's stunned expression, aware of Marcus standing quietly beside her, his own expression carefully, deliberately neutral, giving her every possible opportunity to simply let the joke fade quietly into the night without further complication. But something in her chest, something that had been slowly shifting and rebuilding itself throughout the entire chaotic evening, refused to let the moment pass so easily. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to hear, though not loud enough to reach the entire courtyard. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." 12 years ago, before everything was taken from you, before tonight. She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Who were you? Before all of this?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the golden light, something vulnerable and unguarded finally surfacing behind his careful composure. "Someone who believed talent alone would be enough to earn respect," he said finally. "I learned the hard way that it isn't, not in that world. And now, Marcus said slowly, "I'm someone who fixes things quietly without expecting anyone to notice, because expecting recognition only sets you up for disappointment." He paused, something shifting in his expression as he studied her. "Or at least, that's who I was until about 2 hours ago." Clara felt her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the entire evening suddenly narrowing down to this single quiet exchange between them, largely ignored now by a crowd more interested in the still-running engine and the departed villains than in the quiet conversation unfolding near the driver's side door. "I made you a promise tonight," she said softly, in front of everyone, as a joke born out of humiliation and desperation, never meant to be taken seriously. "I know. But you kept your end of it anyway, even knowing it was a joke, even after everyone laughed at you." Her voice trembled slightly. "Why?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because fixing this car was never really about the promise, Clara. It was about doing the work in front of me correctly, regardless of who was watching or what they thought of me while I did it. That's always been true long before tonight, long before you ever knew my name." Clara nodded slowly, something settling quietly into place behind her eyes, a decision forming with unexpected clarity despite the chaos of the last several hours. "I don't want to hold you to a promise made as a cruel joke," she said. "That wouldn't be fair to either of us." Something flickered across Marcus's face, too brief and too carefully controlled for Clara to fully read. "But," she continued, drawing a steadying breath, "I would like the chance to actually know you, not the handyman I walked past for 3 years without a second glance, not the quiet vindication of tonight's revelations. Just you. if you'd be willing to give me that chance." The courtyard around them seemed to hold its breath, even those guests distracted by the roaring engine and the lingering shock of Theodore's betrayal, sensing somehow that something quietly significant was unfolding near the car's open door. Marcus studied her for a long, silent moment, 12 years of guarded caution warring visibly behind his eyes, with something that looked unmistakably like hope finally daring to resurface after over a decade of careful suppression. "I think," he said slowly, "I'd like that very much. I think I'd like that very much." The words settled over the courtyard like the first quiet breath after a long-held one, and for a moment Clara forgot entirely about the 150,000 strangers watching through Bianca's phone, forgot about her mother's stunned expression, forgot about the wreckage of betrayal still smoldering at the edges of the evening. There was only Marcus standing in front of her in his worn work uniform, looking at her the way no one had looked at her in years, without calculation, without agenda, simply present. Then reality reasserted itself the way it always does with the sound of sirens approaching from the front gate. 2 black sedans pulled up beyond the estate's entrance within minutes, followed by a marked police vehicle, its lights washing blue and red across the mansion's ivory facade. Clara's head snapped up her earlier softness, hardening instantly back into the sharp, decisive clarity that had carried her through the last 3 hours. "That was fast," Richard said, glancing toward the gate with visible surprise. "I called them the moment Daniel was escorted off the property," Clara admitted. "I wasn't going to give any of them time to disappear." A uniformed detective approached the courtyard, flanked by 2 officers, his eyes sweeping across the scene with the practiced efficiency of someone who had clearly already been briefed on at least part of what had unfolded. "Ms. Whitmore, Detective Alan Reyes, LAPD, Financial Crimes Division. We received your call about 20 minutes ago, and then about 10 minutes ago, we started getting calls from 3 different news outlets asking us to confirm a live stream that's apparently gone viral." Clara let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the first genuine laugh she'd managed all evening. "That would be accurate, Detective. We picked up Daniel Cross about half a mile from here." Reyes continued, flipping open a small notebook. "He wasn't exactly hard to find, sitting on a bus bench, apparently still trying to figure out his next move." He glanced around the courtyard. "We also have units en route to intercept a Victor Callahan based on the vehicle description your security team provided. And I understand there's a 3rd individual involved, a Theodore Whitmore. My uncle," Clara said, the words still feeling foreign and painful in her mouth. "He left about 15 minutes ago. I don't know where he'd go." "We'll find him," Reyes said grimly. "Men like that rarely disappear as thoroughly as they think they can. Not anymore anyway, not with this many witnesses and this much footage already circulating." He glanced toward Bianca, still quietly live-streaming from a respectful distance. "I don't suppose I could get a copy of that recording." "I'll send it to you personally," Bianca said, practically vibrating with the surreal thrill of being asked by an actual detective. All of it. Every second. "12:40 a.m. Marcus stood beside Clara as Detective Reyes worked through the courtyard, methodically collecting statements, photographing the tampered components Marcus had carefully preserved rather than discarded, bagging the corroded relay switch and the mismatched bracket as evidence. "You kept all of it," Reyes observed, studying the neatly organized pieces Marcus had laid out on a nearby table. "Most people in the middle of chaos like this just want the problem gone. You preserved a chain of evidence like you knew exactly what you were doing." "I've testified in front of a review board before," Marcus said quietly. 12 years ago, I learned the hard way that evidence disappears when powerful people want it to. I wasn't about to let that happen again." Reyes studied him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "Bennett," he said slowly. "Marcus Bennett. Why does that name sound familiar?" "It might come up in your investigation," Marcus said simply. "There's a connection between tonight and something that happened a long time ago. Detective Ashford here can walk you through it better than I can." Richard stepped forward, launching into a careful, methodical account of the racing scandal of Theodore's confession of the 8-year pattern connecting tonight's sabotage to Callahan's previous similar schemes in Monaco and Chicago. Reyes listened intently, his pen moving rapidly across his notebook, occasionally glancing back toward Marcus, with an expression that had shifted from professional curiosity into something closer to genuine respect. "This is going to be a considerably bigger case than a single sabotaged car," Reyes said, finally closing his notebook. "If even half of what you're describing holds up, we're looking at wire fraud conspiracy, possibly racketeering charges spanning multiple states." He looked at Clara. "You should expect this investigation to take months, Ms. Whitmore, possibly longer." "Take as long as you need," Clara said firmly. "I want all of them held accountable, every single one." 1:15 a.m. As the police finished their initial round of statements and the remaining guests slowly began drifting toward their cars, exhausted and thoroughly transformed. By an evening none of them would ever fully forget. Eleanor approached Clara with an expression Clara had rarely seen on her mother's face. Something small, something humbled. "I owe you an apology as well," Eleanor said quietly, glancing briefly toward Marcus before returning her attention to her daughter. "Not just for not knowing about the finances, for teaching you your entire life that people like Marcus existed somewhere beneath your notice. That kindness and value were only owed to people who dressed a certain way, spoke a certain way, carried a certain kind of confidence that had nothing to do with actual character." Clara felt tears threatening again, exhaustion and emotion tangling together after hours of unbearable tension. "It's not too late to unlearn that, Mother." "No," Eleanor agreed softly. "I don't suppose it is." She turned toward Marcus, drawing herself up with visible effort, the practiced elegance of decades finally bending toward something genuine. "Mr. Bennett, I don't believe I have properly thanked you for saving what remained of tonight, and quite possibly for saving considerably more than that." "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Whitmore." "I do," Eleanor said firmly, "and I intend to spend considerably more effort than a single sentence proving it." 2 a.m. The last of the guests had finally departed the courtyard, now empty, save for a handful of exhausted household staff quietly clearing away abandoned champagne glasses, Detective Reyes and his team finishing their final sweep of the crime scene, and Clara standing beside Marcus near the now silent, fully repaired roadster, both of them too emotionally spent to do anything but simply exist in the quiet aftermath together. "I should probably explain something to you," Marcus said, finally breaking the comfortable silence between them. "About who I was before tonight, before you knew any of this. You don't have to explain anything right now. You've had enough for one night." "I want to," Marcus said, and something in his voice carried a quiet determination that made Clara simply nod and wait. 12 years ago, I graduated top of my class in mechanical engineering. Full scholarship. First in my family to attend college at all, let alone graduate with honors from a program that specialized in advanced automotive systems. He paused, memory flickering visibly behind his eyes. I was recruited straight out of school by one of the most prestigious racing teams on the West Coast. I thought I'd made it. I thought talent alone would carry me exactly as far as I was willing to work. And then the championship failure happened. Marcus confirmed quietly. "I'd flagged that engine 3 separate times. Documented every warning in writing sent through the proper channels, copied to every supervisor who should have taken it seriously. When it failed anyway during the single most important race of the season in front of millions of viewers, the team needed someone to blame immediately, someone whose failure wouldn't threaten the sponsorship deals already in motion." His jaw tightened. "I was 26 years old. I had no institutional power, no connections, no one willing to risk their own position by standing up for mine. It took less than a week for my entire career to disappear." "What did you do afterward?" "I tried everything," Marcus admitted. "Filed formal complaints, requested independent technical reviews of the failure. Every single review board I approached was staffed by people who owed favors to men like Theodore. Eventually, I simply ran out of doors to knock on." He was quiet for a moment. "I took a job doing general maintenance work because it was the only industry willing to hire someone with my history without asking too many questions. I told myself it was temporary. It became 12 years. Clara felt her chest ache with a grief that wasn't entirely her own, borrowed from 12 years of quiet, unjust suffering she'd never once suspected existed beneath the surface of a man she'd walked past in her own hallways without a second glance. You never tried to reclaim it, your reputation, your career. I tried, Marcus said. For 6 months I tried everything I could think of, and then I made a choice. I decided that surviving with my dignity intact mattered more than continuing to bang against a door that would never open for someone who looked like me, no matter how loudly I knocked. He met her eyes steadily. I'm not ashamed of the last 12 years, Clara. I kept my integrity when the entire industry tried to convince me it didn't matter. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, Clara agreed softly. It's everything. 2:40 a.m. Detective Reyes approached one final time before departing, his expression carrying the weight of a long night that clearly wasn't finished yet. We picked up Callahan about 20 minutes ago, he informed them. Trying to board a private flight out of Van Nuys, and we've got units actively searching for Theodore Whitmore, though he seems to have anticipated the possibility and covered his tracks reasonably well for the moment. He'll surface eventually, Richard said grimly. Men like Theodore always overestimate how thoroughly money can insulate them from consequences. In the meantime, Reyes said, turning toward Marcus, I'd strongly recommend you retain a lawyer, Mr. Bennett. Given the scope of what's likely to come out during this investigation, your original career termination is going to become a significant piece of evidence. I suspect the Racing Commission is going to owe you a considerably overdue apology at minimum. Marcus nodded slowly, something cautiously hopeful settling behind his exhausted eyes for what felt like the first time in over a decade. 3 days later, the story had exploded far beyond anything anyone present that night could have anticipated. Bianca's original live stream had surpassed 12 million views within 48 hours, and within a week, every major news outlet in the country had picked up some version of the headline that had already become inescapable across social media. Billionaire heiress mocked her black handyman, then he exposed a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. Clara sat in her father's old study, surrounded by financial documents. She was only now, for the first time in her life, actually reading in detail when her phone buzzed with a call from her family's legal team. Ms. Whitmore, the attorney said, her voice carrying a note of cautious optimism Clara hadn't heard from anyone associated with the estate in days. I wanted to update you on the financial audit. It appears your family's overall position is considerably healthier than Daniel Cross led everyone to believe. Clara's breath caught. What do you mean? The debts he described were real, but significantly smaller than he claimed. Roughly $4 million against an estate worth well over $300 million. Entirely manageable through ordinary asset management, nothing close to the crisis he used to justify selling your father's collection. The attorney paused. It appears Daniel exaggerated the severity of the situation specifically to create the pressure necessary to justify tonight's sabotage. Classic manufactured urgency. He lied about the finances, Clara said slowly, fury and relief tangling together in her chest. He manufactured an entire crisis just to force me into a decision that would have benefited Callahan and Theodore. It appears so, yes. Clara closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, feeling 12 years of unnecessary anxiety about her family's future evaporate in a single phone call, replaced by clean, focused anger at how thoroughly she had been manipulated by someone she'd trusted completely for years. That evening, she drove to the small, unassuming apartment complex where Marcus lived, a modest building, nothing like the sprawling estate she'd grown up in, and found him sitting on the front steps with a cup of coffee, looking exhausted, but calm in a way she hadn't seen from him since the chaos of the gala. The estate's finances are fine, she said, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation. Daniel lied about the severity of the debt. There was never any real crisis. He manufactured the entire thing. Marcus absorbed this, quietly nodding slowly. That tracks with everything else about that night. Manufactured crisis, manufactured urgency, manufactured desperation. All of it designed to make you feel like you had no choice but to accept whatever offer Callahan eventually made. I keep thinking about how close it came to working, Clara admitted, wrapping her arms around her knees. If you hadn't stepped forward, if you'd stayed quiet like everyone probably expected you to. I almost did stay quiet, Marcus admitted. For about 30 seconds, standing at the back of that crowd, watching everyone laugh at the idea of a handyman fixing what professional mechanics couldn't. I almost just walked away and let the night play out, however it was going to play out. What changed your mind? Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. I watched your face, he said finally. Right before you turned away to hide the tears. You weren't performing grief for the cameras. You were genuinely devastated, genuinely trying to hold together something that mattered to you, far beyond money or reputation. I recognized that kind of grief. I'd carried something similar myself for 12 years. I couldn't just watch someone else lose something that mattered that much without at least trying to help. Clara felt tears gathering again, though these carried none of the earlier evening's panic or humiliation. Thank you, she said softly. Not just for the car, for seeing something worth saving in me, even when I'd spent 3 years failing to see anything at all in you. 2 weeks later, the investigation had expanded dramatically beyond anyone's initial expectations. Detective Reyes called Clara personally to deliver an update that left her sitting in stunned silence for several minutes after hanging up. Theodore Whitmore had been apprehended attempting to cross into Mexico, his private accounts frozen pending a full forensic audit that had already uncovered evidence of sabotage operations spanning not 3 but 11 separate high-value restorations across 4 states, totaling losses estimated at over $40 million for the families involved. Victor Callahan, facing charges of wire fraud conspiracy and racketeering, had begun cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing detailed testimony that implicated Theodore even further. Daniel Cross, whose financial deception had been the least severe of the conspiracy's many layers, pleaded guilty to fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, receiving a sentence that included both prison time and full restitution. And Vanessa Rourke, the woman in the green dress, had been arrested, attempting to flee the country 3 days after the gala, her laptop containing detailed technical schematics for every sabotage operation she'd executed on Callahan's behalf over the previous 6 years. There's something else, Reyes told Clara during that same call. Something specifically related to Marcus. What is it? The Racing Commission has reopened the investigation into his original termination 12 years ago. With Theodore's confession and the financial connections we've uncovered between his old racing team and Callahan's current operation, it's become impossible for them to maintain the original findings. I think you should let Marcus know himself, but off the record, I'd expect a full formal exoneration within the next few months. Clara drove straight to Marcus's apartment the moment the call ended, finding him in the small parking lot working on an old sedan that clearly belonged to one of his neighbors. His hands stained with grease, his expression calm and focused in the way she'd come to recognize as uniquely his own. "I have news," she said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. Marcus looked up, wiping his hands on a rag, something cautiously hopeful already forming behind his eyes as he read her expression. "Good news, I'm guessing." "The Racing Commission is reopening your case," Clara said. "Detective Reyes thinks you're going to be fully exonerated, officially, publicly." Marcus went very still, the rag falling forgotten from his hands. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Clara watched something enormous move behind his carefully guarded expression. 12 years of quiet, unresolved grief finally beginning to crack open into something she couldn't quite name. "After 12 years," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. He clearly hadn't expected to feel so intensely. "After 12 years of everyone telling me it was pointless to keep fighting." "You didn't have to fight anymore," Clara said softly. The truth finally caught up on its own. Marcus sat down slowly on the curb beside his neighbor's car, and Clara sat beside him watching quietly as he processed 12 years of buried injustice, finally unexpectedly finding its resolution. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a rawness she hadn't heard from him before, not even during the chaos of the gala. "I used to imagine this moment," he admitted. "In the early years before I made myself stop hoping for it, I used to imagine someone finally believing me, finally seeing what actually happened, instead of what was convenient to believe." He shook his head slowly. "I never imagined it would happen because a mansion full of billionaires laughed at me for offering to fix a car." "I'm sorry I was one of them," Clara said quietly. "Laughing, I mean. Before I understood who you actually were." "You stopped laughing faster than anyone else in that courtyard," Marcus said, glancing sideways at her with something warm finally breaking through his exhaustion. "That matters more than you probably realize." 6 weeks after the gala, Clara stood in front of a small gathering of reporters outside the Whitmore estate announcing the formation of a new initiative that had consumed nearly every waking hour since the investigation's dramatic conclusion. The Charles Whitmore Foundation for Skilled Trades, funded with an initial endowment of $15 million, designed specifically to provide scholarships, mentorship, and career advancement opportunities for talented tradespeople and engineers who had been overlooked or unfairly pushed out of their fields due to discrimination, corporate politics, or simple lack of institutional connection. "My father spent his life valuing craftsmanship," Clara told the assembled press, her voice steady and clear, despite the weight of everything the last 6 weeks had revealed about her family's complicated legacy. Not the craftsmanship that comes with a prestigious degree or a corner office, but the kind that shows up quietly every single day, keeping the world running in ways most of us never bother to notice. This foundation exists because someone finally showed me exactly how much that kind of quiet excellence deserves to be recognized. Standing near the back of the small crowd, Marcus watched the announcement with an expression of quiet, overwhelmed pride, though he'd insisted repeatedly over the previous weeks that Clara didn't need to build an entire foundation around what had happened to him personally. "This isn't just about you," Clara had told him firmly more than once. "This is about every person like you, every talented engineer or mechanic or tradesperson who got pushed aside by someone protecting their own position instead of recognizing real skill when they saw it. You were the one who showed me that gap existed. Now I intend to close it." 2 months later, the Racing Commission issued a formal public statement fully exonerating Marcus Bennett of any responsibility for the championship engine failure 12 years earlier, acknowledging that internal documentation only recently uncovered during the broader Whitmore investigation definitively proved he had flagged the exact failure that eventually occurred multiple times through proper channels and had been unjustly blamed to protect senior staff and sponsorship relationships. The statement made national news running alongside follow-up coverage of Theodore Whitmore's sentencing, which had concluded just days earlier with a 12-year prison sentence for racketeering, conspiracy, and wire fraud, a sentence that felt to everyone who had watched the scandal unfold both entirely justified and somehow still insufficient given the scope of damage he'd caused across nearly a decade of quiet manipulation. Richard Ashford, who had remained closely involved throughout the entire investigation, personally funded the establishment of a technical advisory board specifically designed to prevent future sabotage schemes within the vintage restoration industry, naming Marcus as its founding director, a position that came with both a substantial salary and, more importantly to Marcus, the kind of professional respect and recognition he'd been denied for over a decade. "You realize," Richard told him during the small announcement ceremony, "that this makes you one of the most sought-after restoration experts in the entire country. Every major collector on the West Coast is going to want your expertise now." "I appreciate that," Marcus said, still visibly adjusting to the strange, unfamiliar sensation of genuine professional recognition. "Though I think I'll always feel a little more comfortable with my hands actually inside an engine than sitting behind a desk." "Then we'll make sure you spend plenty of time doing exactly that," Richard said, clasping his shoulder warmly. "The world needs more people like you, Marcus. People who actually care about doing the work right, regardless of who's watching." 4 months after this gala, Clara found herself once again standing in the same courtyard where the entire scandal had first unfolded, though the atmosphere surrounding her tonight carried none of the earlier evening's tension or cruelty. This time, the gathering was smaller, more intimate close friends and family, celebrating the successful completion of the Roadster's full restoration certification, an official milestone that had been delayed for months by the ongoing investigation, but finally formally completed. Marcus stood beside the car running one final inspection before the evening's small celebration began, and Clara approached quietly watching him work with the same careful, focused attention that had first caught her genuine curiosity all those months earlier. "You know," she said, "I don't think I ever properly thanked you for everything. Not just the car, everything." "You've thanked me plenty of times," Marcus said, straightening up with a small smile. "The foundation alone was thanks enough for several lifetimes." "The foundation wasn't about thanking you," Clara corrected gently. "The foundation was about making sure what happened to you never happens to someone else without consequences. This," she gestured slightly between them, "this is about something else entirely." Marcus set down his tools, turning to face her fully, something quietly attentive in his expression as he waited for her to continue. "4 months ago," Clara said, "I made you a promise as a cruel joke in front of 250 people, because I was desperate and humiliated and looking for any way to reclaim some control over an evening that had already spiraled completely out of my hands." She paused, drawing a steadying breath. "You spent the next several hours proving over and over again that you were worth infinitely more than the punchline I'd reduced you to. And in the months since spending time with you, actually getting to know who you are beneath everything that happened that night, I've realized something I wasn't expecting to realize at all." "What's that?" Marcus asked softly. "That the joke I made that night, however cruel and thoughtless it was in the moment, somehow accidentally led me toward the truest thing I've ever felt about anyone." Clara felt her voice tremble slightly, though she pushed forward anyway, refusing to let the fear of vulnerability stop her, the way it had stopped her from truly seeing him for 3 long years. "I'm not asking you to marry me because of a promise made in humiliation, Marcus. I'm telling you that somewhere in the last 4 months, without either of us really planning it, I fell in love with the man who refused to walk away from a broken engine and a broken family, and a woman who didn't deserve his patience but received it anyway." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, something deep and unguarded moving behind his eyes as he absorbed the weight of what she'd just said. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its earlier careful restraint, only something warm and certain that Clara felt settle instantly into her chest, like a held breath finally released. "I think," he said slowly, "I fell for you somewhere between that first mismatched bracket and Theodore's confession. I just didn't think it was my place to say so, given everything else that night had already put you through. And now," Marcus said, reaching for her hand with a gentleness that carried 12 years of carefully guarded hope, finally allowing itself to surface completely, "I think it's exactly the right time to say it." Clara felt tears gathering, though these carried nothing but pure, unguarded joy, standing in the same courtyard where humiliation had once threatened to define an entire evening, now transformed instead into the place where something genuine and lasting had quietly, unexpectedly taken root. 1 year after the gala, the Whitmore estate hosted another celebration, though this one bore no resemblance whatsoever to the chaotic, scandal-ridden evening that had first brought Clara and Marcus together. Family and friends gathered beneath strings of warm golden lights, the same restored roadster parked prominently near the entrance, its engine now running as flawlessly as the day it had first rolled off the assembly line, decades earlier, a permanent gleaming testament to everything that particular machine had come to represent. Clara stood at the altar in a simple ivory gown, nothing like the elaborate gold dress she'd worn the night everything began, and watched Marcus walk toward her with the same quiet, steady confidence that had first caught her attention as he'd calmly announced in front of a mocking, disbelieving crowd that he understood machines. Richard Ashford, now serving as an unofficial mentor and close friend to both of them, stood proudly among the small gathering, occasionally wiping his eyes with theatrical exaggeration that made Clara laugh, despite the solemnity of the moment. Eleanor Whitmore, transformed considerably over the past year by genuine reflection on the values she'd unknowingly passed down to her daughter, sat in the front row with tears streaming freely down her face, no longer bothering to maintain the careful composure that had once defined her every public appearance. Detective Reyes had sent his congratulations from the ongoing prosecution of Theodore's remaining associates, a case that had expanded into one of the largest fraud investigations in the vintage automotive industry's history, ultimately recovering over $60 million in restitution for the many families Theodore and Callahan had quietly victimized over nearly a decade of coordinated sabotage. As Marcus reached the altar, taking Clara's hands in his own, the officiant began the ceremony with words that felt to everyone gathered like the natural conclusion of a story that had begun with cruelty and humiliation, but had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, transformed into something genuinely, unshakably beautiful. "We are gathered here today," the officiant began, to witness the union of two people whose story began under circumstances neither of them could have possibly anticipated. Clara squeezed Marcus's hands gently, remembering every step of the impossible journey that had led them to this exact moment. The mocking laughter, the tampered engine, the desperate promise made in humiliation. The quiet, methodical way Marcus had uncovered truth after devastating truth, refusing to back down, even as powerful men threatened everything he'd rebuilt after 12 years of unjust exile from the career he'd once loved. A machine doesn't care who fixes it, Marcus had told her months earlier, sharing a lesson his grandfather had once taught him during long summer afternoons spent tinkering with old engines. It only cares if the person understands it. Clara had come to understand over the past year that the same principle applied far beyond machinery. People didn't need designer suits or prestigious degrees or family names carrying generational wealth to deserve respect, recognition, or genuine love. They simply needed someone willing to look closely enough to actually see them. The world had laughed the night a quiet handyman stepped forward, offering to fix what professional experts had already declared impossible. That same world now watched 1 year later as that same man exchanged vows with the billionaire heiress who had once mocked him in front of 250 guests, transformed entirely by his quiet courage, his unwavering integrity, and his refusal to let injustice define the rest of his life. Because sometimes the person standing quietly at the edge of the room, overlooked and underestimated by everyone who mattered, turns out to be exactly the person everyone needed all along. And sometimes, when the world finally stops long enough to truly see them, an entire legacy, an entire family, an entire life gets the chance to be rebuilt stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. Marcus Bennett had spent 12 years believing his story had already ended in quiet, unjust defeat. He was wrong. His story had simply been waiting patiently for someone brave enough to finally listen.